Have you ever wondered about the secrets of the Middle Ages? This time, from the 5th to the 15th century, is filled with puzzles and big changes. It's a time that tells stories of knights and rich people, of kings and queens, of big castles and strong walls. The Middle Ages, often seen as a dark and slow time, was actually full of life with deep changes that shaped today's world. From the ruins of the Roman Empire, new kingdoms were born, making a mix of cultures, religions, and societies that still interest us today. This was a time when swords clashed on battlefields, when scholars wrote on paper, and when the sounds of church bells filled the stone streets. Come with us as we the secrets of the Middle Ages, a time of knights, kings, and many battles. Think about a world where your life is controlled by a system called feudalism. Feudalism sounds old and unfamiliar, like something from a long time ago. But during the Middle Ages, it was very important. It was a system that affected everyone, from the king to the poorest workers. To understand feudalism, imagine a pyramid. The king is at the top. He's the boss, but he doesn't rule alone. Under him are the lords. These are rich and powerful people who promise to help the king. They give him soldiers when there's a war. In return, the king gives these lords lands to rule. But who works on these lands? That's where the knights and workers come in. Knights are the fighters. They promise to fight for their lords for parts of the land. The workers, however, do most of the work. They are the farmers and laborers who work all day to keep things running. But why did feudalism start? It happened after the Roman Empire fell, and there was a lot of chaos. People needed protection from local lords, and the lords needed the king's support. It was a system made to bring order when things were very messy. Feudalism wasn't perfect. It allowed a few people at the top to benefit from the work of many at the bottom, but it also brought some stability and order to a confusing time. Feudalism, despite being complicated, held society together during the Middle Ages. Ever wondered about the big battles that changed the world long ago? Let's go back to a time known as the Middle Ages. During this time, there were many wars fought because of religion. These wars were called the Crusades. These wars lasted for 200 years and were not just about who had more power or land. They were about religion, mainly between Christians and Muslims. The Crusades started at the end of the 11th century, when Pope Urban II asked Christians to fight and take back the city of Jerusalem from the Muslims. Thousands of people answered his call and started the First Crusade. These wars had a lot of violence, but also acts of bravery. Famous battles like the capturing of Jerusalem in the First Crusade, and important people like Richard the Lionheart and Saladin during the Third Crusade have been written into history. But the Crusades were not only about wars and religion, they changed the way people lived. They led to a lot of sharing of ideas between the East and West in areas like art, literature, and science. They also changed the way people used money because soldiers needed funds for their trips. This need gave rise to and lending money, changing how Europe's economy worked. But the Crusades also caused problems. They made Christians and Muslims and dislike each other, something still felt today. They were a time of big changes. They how strong people's beliefs can be, how cultures can survive, and how history can affect our lives. The Crusades were more than just wars over religion. They brought about change, showed the human spirit, and were an important part of the Middle Ages. The Crusades were wars over religion that changed the Middle Ages a lot. Have you ever thought about what could happen if a deadly disease wiped out almost half of all the people? Let's travel back to the Middle Ages when this scary event actually happened. This was when the Black Death happened. It was a terrible disease that spread all over Europe, killing many people. The Black Death started in Asia. Fleas that lived on black rats carried the disease. These rats traveled on ships that were selling things. When these ships reached Europe, the disease spread very quickly, reaching all parts of the continent in just a few years. The Black Death did not care if you were poor or rich, it affected everyone. Healthy people would suddenly get sick with painful dark boils on their bodies. This disease was so strong that many people died within a week of getting sick. The Black Death changed society a lot. With so many people dying, whole villages disappeared, no one was farming the fields, and money lost its value. But in this chaos, change started to happen. Since there weren't a lot of workers, the ones who were left could ask for better pay living conditions. This changed the way society worked. Art and writing also changed, showing the sad reality of life. But it also led to new things being created. The need for better treatments led to new ideas in medicine and made people question old beliefs. The Black Death was not just a deadly disease, but also a trigger for change and growth in Europe. It changed society, economy, and culture. It made people question their beliefs, their leaders, and their lifestyle. The Black Death was a terrible event that had a big effect on the Middle Ages. But as we learn more about this time, we'll see that even in the middle of sadness, there were seeds of progress and change. Ever imagine knights in shiny armor, bravely guarding their kingdom? We can't talk about the Middle Ages without talking about the Age of Chivalry. This was a time when bravery and goodness were not just liked, but needed. Chivalry, a word that comes from the French word for knight, chevalier, was more than an idea. It was like a set of rules that knights followed. It helped shape what was normal and important during this time. So what was in this set of rules? It was about fighting skills, being polite, and believing in religion. Knights were to be brave in war, faithful to their lords, and nice to everyone, especially women. They were the heroes of the weak, the fighters for fairness, and the best at being polite in the court. But chivalry was not just about war or court life. It also had a big impact on the art and books of the Middle Ages. Stories about brave knights and their good acts were liked a lot, shaping the dreamy and heroic images we have of this time. Chivalry also helped shape how society was set up. It gave the noble class a way to behave and helped keep the system of lords and servants. The knights, often born into noble families, kept the peace in their areas. But chivalry was not simple. It praised war and violence, but also being nice and respectful. It stressed the need to believe in religion, but knights were often in bloody fights and battles for power. Even with these contradictions, or maybe because of them, chivalry deeply affected the Middle Ages. As we learn more about this time, we see that the Age of Chivalry was not just about knights and their good acts. It was about a society trying to find peace and purpose during a crazy time. Chivalry was not just an idea, but a way of life during the Middle Ages. Did you know that the Middle Ages wasn't just about fights and illnesses? It was also a time of big, important discoveries. Let's learn more about these cool inventions made during medieval times. First, let's talk about the mechanical clock. Before the clock was invented, time was told using sundials and water clocks, but these were not always reliable, especially when it was cloudy or there was no wind. When the mechanical clock came along, it changed how people lived, helping them be on time and have a routine. This helped set the stage for the Industrial Revolution. Next, let's look at something we use every day: glasses. Early glasses were invented in Italy in the 13th century. They were very helpful for people like scholars, writers, and craftsmen who needed to see clearly for their jobs. Glasses helped many people stay productive for longer, encouraged and helped spread knowledge. But what good would reading do without books? This brings us to the printing press. It was invented at the very end of the Middle Ages, but the ideas for it started during this time. The printing press made books cheaper and easier to get, which helped start the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment. We also can't forget the amazing buildings and designs. The Middle Ages was when some of the most famous buildings in history, like tall cathedrals and powerful castles, were built. These buildings showed off power and faith, and were some of the best designs of the time. From the mechanical clock to the printing press, all these inventions from the Middle Ages have made a big difference in our world today. They show how smart and strong people can be, even during hard times. So remember, even though it was a tough time, the Middle Ages was a time of great discoveries and progress. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up and find the world changing? Think about living in a world that's always changing, like a painter getting a canvas ready for a new creation. People experienced this during the end of the Middle Ages. This time was full of big changes that lead to the time we know as the Renaissance. The Middle Ages, a time with knights and castles, was very traditional and had a strict social structure. But when the 15th century started, everything began to change, replacing old things with new ones. Art started to change too. It used to be mainly about religion, but artists started to try new things, like showing people's feelings in their work. Famous artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were part of this change. Their amazing artwork still amazes us today. Science also started to develop again. People rediscovered ancient knowledge from the Greeks and Romans, causing a thirst for learning and exploring. Scholars like Copernicus and Galileo made people rethink their place in the universe, leading to big in science. Culture was also growing. Things like literature, music, and philosophy were thriving. Think about the plays of Shakespeare, the poems of Petrarch, and the music of Palestrina. It was a time of new ideas where people started to question and dream. But it wasn't just art and science that were changing. Society was changing too. The old social system was falling apart and being replaced by new social and economic systems. The growth of the merchant class, along with new technology and exploration, helped create the modern world as we know it. The end of the Middle Ages was the start of a new age, an age of learning and rebirth. And so, as the Middle Ages ended, the Renaissance began, a time of change, new ideas, and amazing accomplishments by people. So, what can we learn from the Middle Ages today? This is a question we've traveled back in time to answer, looking at the past to understand the present and guess about the future. Our trip took us to the rise of a ruling system called feudalism. While it's very different to our thinking about democracy today, it shaped the idea of government we have now. This time was ruled by kings, lords, and servants, each with their own jobs. This shows how people related to each other and how power was shared, things that still happen in our society. We also looked at the Crusades, a series of religious wars. These wars changed the world map and began a new exchange of ideas, cultures, and technologies. Even though it was a hard time, the Crusades made the world more mixed and diverse, which still affects us today. Our trip also took us to some sad parts of history, like the plague. This difficult time showed us the importance of being strong, understanding science, and taking care of public health, which is still important today. Next, we traveled to a time when honor, bravery, and duty were seen as very important. These values, even though they look different today, are still cherished in our world. Our look at medieval inventions showed us that humans are always searching for new knowledge and improvement. From windmills to clocks, these inventions still inspire technology today. As we saw the start of a new period, we saw the beginning of the Renaissance, a time of new ideas that changed human history forever. The Middle Ages, a time of mysteries and wonders, still fascinate us today. They remind us of our past as we think about our future. From past events, we learn for today and hope for tomorrow, knowing that history is not just a record of time, but a book of lessons.